Balls coming, and there goes our chandelier.
The chandelier goes up and down. It's a lot of things happening in this studio.
I mean, one of the big questions that's materializing here tonight is whether or not, there might be a pretty big red brick wall happening in a number of places in terms of what we've seen in Virginia, Riggleman, Barr, some of these races that looked like they were going the other way. Whether the blue wave will materialize as we continue to move through the night, I mean, that is the question. But some of the early things that we went in here with, in terms of anticipation and early luck, are materializing in quite an
Andy Barr,
way.
Kentucky 6, pulling out a big win there. And now we're looking really heavily at Florida, Indiana. It has moved towards the Republicans in both the governor's race and the Senate races there. And we're starting to get raw vote totals in Missouri and other places. And we have this countdown that is happening. And you have to keep
talking until you get to 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. And now,
there we go.
It is 9 o'clock on the East Coast, and polls have just closed in 14 more states, including Arizona, Texas, and North Dakota. Each of those will have a major impact on whether Republicans retain control of the U.S. Senate. It
will not come as a surprise to you that Arizona is too early to say whether Republican Congresswoman Martha McSally will beat Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema to succeed retiring GOP Senator Jeff Flake.
Also too early to project a winner in Texas. This race obviously getting a lot of attention. Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke trying to unseat incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz in what has become the most expensive Senate race in U.S. history. At the moment, Cruz has a very slight lead.
O'Rourke has a very slight lead, it looks like.
Oh, I think this is using voter analysis and raw vote total.
Putting it all together. It's pretty close. Anyway, in Texas at this point. And in North Dakota, we are waiting for more data to project where we are in this race with the incumbent Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp and her Republican challenger, Congressman Kevin Cramer. As of the poll closing, Cramer is in the lead right now. A pretty sizable lead, but we've only got 4% of the vote in right there.
The other hotly contested race we're watching at this hour in Wisconsin, incumbent Republican Governor Scott Walker currently trailing Democrat Tony Evers, the state's education superintendent. Too early to make a call there.
Let's go to New York for a moment. Governor Andrew Cuomo, who defeated Sex and the City actress Cynthia Nixon 7 weeks ago in the Democratic primary, today wins a third term by beating handily Republican Mark Molinaro.
Also in New York, Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand will win re-election to a second full term by defeating Republican Shelley Farley. She's being talked about as a possible presidential candidate, by the way.
And in one of the two Senate races in Minnesota today, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar will win a third term by beating GOP state lawmaker Jim Newberger. She's also discussed as a possible 2020 Democrat candidate.
In the other Minnesota Senate race, Democratic Senator Tina Smith will win election to fill the remainder of Senator Al Franken's term until January 2021. She defeated the state senator Karen Housley.
And let's look at Wisconsin, where Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin will win a second term. She has defeated GOP State Senator Leah Vukmir.
Keep in mind that as of 9 p.m. Eastern Time, polls have closed in fully 80% of congressional districts across the country, including most of the tightest toss-up races that will determine control of the U.S. House of Representatives. So if Democrats, remember, pick up a net gain of 23 seats, they will take control of the chamber for the first time since 2011. We are not yet at the place where we can call or make a projection. There's a lot of white on that board, as you see.
This is developing into a very interesting evening. So let's go over to the panel and get your thoughts on what we're seeing so far. Guy Benson joining us. Guy, what do you think?
Well, looking big picture, it's looking like a pretty good night for the Democrats, but not quite the great night that some of them had been hoping for. Kentucky 6 being one of those bellwether House races for the Republican to hang on there in Trump country in Kentucky is a big one. Also, it's not quite over yet in some of these other races, but I know Virginia 5 has been called. That was on the outer limits of a big wave. The Democrats are saying, all right, if we're going to really have a 2010 style wave, we're going to pick up Virginia 5. They've lost that one. And then in Indiana, I know it's still too close for us to call, but that's looking pretty darn good for the Republican Mike Braun. To put a pickup on the board on the Senate side that early would be enormous for the GOP's hopes to hang on to that upper chamber, which has been so crucial to confirming so many judges, including 2 Supreme Court justices during the Trump administration. The Senate is a very important priority for many conservatives.
Speaking of the Senate, we have a major race call to make right now. First, in New Jersey, the Fox News decision desk can now project Democratic Senator Robert Menendez will win re-election by defeating Republican businessman Bob Hugin, although some Republicans had viewed Menendez as very vulnerable due to that federal corruption trial 2017. The 12-year Senate veteran really never trailed Hugin, even though it was called a toss-up by Cook Political Report. He is going to go on and win.
And we have another major race call to make tonight in the Tennessee Senate race. The Fox News decision desk can now project that Republican Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn will defeat former Democratic Governor Phil Bredesen to replace retiring GOP Senator Bob Corker. Although Blackburn spent all summer trailing Bredesen in the polls, she closed the gap. She was a tireless campaigner in this race and took the lead about a month ago. Britt, your thoughts?
Well, that was a race that ended up having a lot to do with Kavanaugh, because Bredesen did come out finally and say that he would have voted for Kavanaugh, and he's been critical of his party ever since. But that was a big deal in the state of Tennessee, and Blackburn made the most of it. And I think that this is one race where the Kavanaugh vote made a real difference.
Yeah, Dana, I think that this race was really interesting. Democrats had a lot of hopes for Phil Bredesen.
Well, the thing is, I was just thinking about this. We just called Menendez in New Jersey. The New Jersey Star-Ledger, when it endorsed Menendez, the headline was, "Choke it down, vote for Menendez." I mean, that's how distasteful it was for them, and yet he wins it. And you think about a state like Florida that we talk a lot about. It's a swing state. We're always going to talk a lot about it. But states like New Jersey, Kentucky, Tennessee, and probably Texas, they tend to be in their natural state. And so this wouldn't be a terrible surprise in New Jersey. And Marsha Blackburn, I believe that, well, I think she was the first woman congresswoman from Tennessee, and now going to the Senate, and she's winning it by that much. I think if Democrats can't figure out a way to win in some of these Midwestern states, southeastern states, they're going to have a lot of soul searching to do, because their expectations were so sky high that they were never going to be able to meet those expectations.
It's interesting, too. Phil Bredesen said in a recent interview that the national Democratic brand failed him, essentially, that he couldn't fit the mold of it. And he, really spent a lot of time trying to sound as Trump-like as he possibly could. Also, just as a side note, they thought it was a big deal when Taylor Swift came out and supported Phil Bredesen. That turned out to not be a positive, ultimately, for Bredesen. So a tough night for Taylor Swift.
Yes. Marie, this is not lining up, I think, exactly like our voter analysis early look.
Yeah.
It is actually skewing more Republican than the original view of some of those numbers.
Well, and I think it will be interesting to see why that is. Did more Democrats, were they fired up and they voted early? Are more Republicans breaking at the end of the day and staying home? And staying home, I mean, by that, voting for Republicans, right? Because I think there was a lot of hope on the Democratic side that especially Republican women, they may not come out and vote for a Democrat, but maybe they just will sit this one out. I think it looks like many of them may have stayed home with their party. But what's interesting, I think, also in some of the early races we're getting called, Donna Shalala winning in Florida. That's a surprise to a lot of us. I did not expect that to go that early. So one thing I think Democrats are looking at across the country is we thought that the Andy Barr race might be a good one to watch for a bellwether, and that's now been called for Republicans. But if we're picking up seats places we didn't think were bellwethers, like this Florida race with Donna Shalala, there are I mentioned this earlier, there are a number of places like Kansas, like Texas, and congressional districts that Democrats are fielding folks that are actually making things competitive. The other thing that's interesting is Ohio, which Donald Trump won by 8 points, almost as much as he won Texas by. Sherrod Brown basically didn't have a contest tonight. Already been called for him in the Senate.
Well, that was long predicted going in.
It was, but the fact that the Trump coalition there couldn't show up to vote for a Republican Senate candidate, I think is interesting and may impact the governor's race.
Laura, let's go back to Florida. I think that these races are going to be really definitive tonight.
Yeah. I mean, it's the current total, and it keeps kind of switching, is about 60 to 70 to 80,000 votes between the candidates. Again, we don't know who's going to ultimately pull this off. But this was a state where, let's say, Rick Scott was a very popular governor, and the state is extremely well run. It was razor-thin margin for Donald Trump. Remember, I think he wanted about, 100,000 or so votes?
I'm just going to interrupt you. We're going to call Joe Manchin winning West Virginia Senate over Patrick Morrissey. There was some thought that Patrick Morrissey could close the gap here, but Joe Manchin, longtime incumbent West Virginia senator, voted for Kavanaugh, is going to return to the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, the Kavanaugh vote, I think, without a doubt, helped him there. But in Florida, again, the president has made so many trips there. I think, obviously, the Southern White House and Mar-a-Lago, but campaign trips there. I think that was critical. But do not discount the power of Rick Scott, who his response to hurricanes, his response to just the general governance of that state, that in and of itself was competence. Competence was on the ballot versus maybe for Nelson, someone who had longevity and seniority. Nelson's not someone who keeps connected to the voters. Gillum is a charismatic guy, but he's far left for the state of Florida. Tallahassee is not the rest of Florida. If Ron DeSantis pulls out a victory, I keep saying this is all Donald Trump's victory tonight.
There are some people who have called the race for DeSantis. We haven't yet, and our not doing so is prudent as always. We've had a very good track record, but it's worth noting that some election experts have called the race for DeSantis to win.
One of the other interesting things when we look at some of the victors tonight in the Senate races on the Democratic side, you can begin to see this Democratic field for president shaping up. Elizabeth Warren won re-election. Bernie Sanders won re-election. Kirsten Gillibrand won re-election. So did Amy Klobuchar. Those are four people that are being mentioned potentially as Democratic presidential candidates. And they all won tonight.
And Chris, if Beto O'Rourke wins in Texas, he's the instant front runner, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Some people would say even if he loses, he can go and start running for president.
All for naught.
Take his $70 million right to Des Moines. 3% in Texas. There you see the early vote. In Texas, you want to see the raw vote total. We have it that using the voter analysis plus the raw total, Ted Cruz with a slight lead, even though that's not what it shows on the screen. But it's tighter than a lot of people thought it was going to be in Texas.
Can I just go back to one thing Dana said? I think sometimes parties fall in love with the idea that they're going to be able to flip a state that they haven't won in for a long time. I think Republicans were chasing this dream in New Jersey with Bob Hugin against Bob Menendez, who obviously had huge ethical problems. And so there was a reason to believe it. But it's a really blue state. And the idea that you were going to get a Republican senator in a state like that was about as unlikely as that you were going to get a Democratic senator in a state like Tennessee. Donald Trump won Tennessee in 2016 by 26 points. So this would, in fact, Phil Bredesen was probably the only Democrat who's had a chance of winning in Tennessee. And as it turns out, you look at the vote there, not much of a chance.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be calling all kinds of races. Associated Press moving Larry Hogan winning a landslide in Maryland. Interesting dynamic there where Republican governors winning in blue states. We're probably going to see others of those tonight.
Charlie Baker, too.
Charlie Baker in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we'll look at Texas. We're going to update you on Indiana because that is an interesting race that we could be getting ready to call in the Senate. Keep it here. America's Election Headquarters continues.
This Thursday.
Indiana, Mike Braun, the Republican, will defeat incumbent Democrat Joe Donnelly. This is a huge win for the Republicans. This is a pickup for the Republicans, taking down incumbent Donnelly, who Democrats really believed was in good shape heading into Election Day. Mike Braun, you remember President Trump went to Indiana a few times, but he closed his campaign in Indiana with a big election night preview there. Mike Braun, the businessman, defeating the incumbent Joe Donnelly.
Yeah, Indiana has been good to President Trump. It was the state that put him over the top during the primary when he beat Ted Cruz there. And he has put a lot of muscle into this Indiana race on behalf of Mike Braun, who, some people questioned whether or not he was a strong candidate going in. And now Mike Braun has sealed the deal in Indiana tonight. Let's bring in Karl Rove. Karl, with your thoughts on that race for starters.
Well, two things. First of all, it looks like both Marion County and Lake County, which are Democratic urban strongholds, are coming in with a smaller total than you might think, given what's happening in the rest of the state. And my suspicion is we're going to see African American vote not excited about turning out to vote. The other thing is he is an interesting candidate. I was talking to a Republican bigwig the other day who actually had gone in to help campaign for him and said, he doesn't have much charisma. And I said, well, what do you expect? I said, Mitch Daniels, Mr. Charisma,
I like Mitch Daniels.
Yeah, well, so do I a lot. But this is a state where Mike Braun fits it. Here's a guy who grew up in Jasper, Indiana, goes to Harvard Business School, gets recruited by some of the biggest companies in America, and decides to go home to Jasper, where he's the vice president of a furniture company, and then decides, I'm going to go start my own business. And so, he comes across as solid, steady, and not very charismatic, but that may be good for Indiana.
Like Tennessee, the Kavanaugh vote moved this race. It definitely affected this race. It shifted it at that time. We should point out on the board that Republicans' net gain is now +1 in the Senate. So Democrats now have to get 3 pickups to take control of the Senate. It gets a lot tougher with Joe Donnelly going down.
Yeah. You mentioned Kavanaugh, and that's right. But and I was looking at surveys in this state in August and September, and Republicans in late August and early September in the private surveys for the Senate Leadership Fund were starting to come home and starting to get excited about coming out. So by the time we got to the 3rd and 4th weeks of September, Kavanaugh was an accelerant. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already burning pretty well. And that has not gone away. The issue of the importance of Kavanaugh has sort of receded in people's minds, but the enthusiasm that it kindled is still there right here at the end.
Yeah, and that was one of the issues that we saw in the voter analysis. It looked like Kavanaugh could even cut the other way. That perhaps it had energized Democrats more than Republicans. It was very close in terms of this voter analysis. And yet, as we have said, you go through, Phil Bredesen was pressed and pressed. What would you have done if you were in the Senate? Finally, he said, I would have voted for Kavanaugh. And you look at Joe Donnelly, who said no. And that was big news when he made that decision. And Joe Manchin, the only Democrat to vote for Kavanaugh, it had a number of positive factors working for him in West Virginia, but that was clearly one of them.
I don't have a little bit of time here before we take a break. I just bounce to Florida. What you're seeing in your magical computer there?
Well, there's still a lot of vote out still in the panhandle for the Republicans, but this one has still got a lot of room to grow.
On the governors and Senate.
Governors and the Senate side, because we have a lot of precincts out in Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach. I will say this. One interesting thing to me is that DeSantis has got more votes than Scott does, but not by a lot, but Scott has 12,000 more votes than DeSantis has, but Gillum is running 40-some-odd thousand votes behind Nelson. So part of this story is not just that the Trump endorsement helped, but also Gillum may be just a little bit too radical for some Floridians. There are 40,000 votes going to the reform candidate, and he's running 40,000 votes behind Nelson. I don't think these things are coincidental.
But the vote out, you're saying there's some parts of Broward, some parts of Miami?
Yeah, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach all have about 300-plus precincts left out. There are a bunch of precincts left out in the Panhandle. The question is going to be a race to how much of the Panhandle offsets the Southeast Florida, and then how many in Southeast Florida can close the now existing gap between the Republicans and Democrats.
Well, here's a positive. The lawyers don't have to fly in. They're ready there and ready for the recount.
Any recount in Florida not only employs every single Florida election law expert, it has everybody across America fully employed for whatever number of days are necessary to conduct the recount.
Like 36.
The memories.
Yeah, well, that's 36 days. Not that we remember that bitterly and
the memories.
Bring back the old memories.
Yes. All right, panel, stand by if you would.
Quick break. We'll be right back after this.
Now, an update on some of the tight races. Here is the governor's race in Florida we've been talking about. 72,000 plus separate Ron DeSantis from Andrew Gillum. As you see, 93%. It's still, that's the vote, the percentage of vote in. Too close to call for us. Then you look at the Senate race, also too close to call. 68,000 separating Rick Scott and Bill Nelson, the incumbent Democrat. Also, let's take a look at Kyrsten Sinema. This is too early. Based on our voter analysis, we don't even have the raw vote total in there. We do have some calls to make, though. Obviously, we just called Indiana Senate for Mike Braun, and we have some governor's races to call as well. In Vermont, Phil Scott will win. For the Republican will defeat the Democrat in Vermont, traditionally skewing Democrat in that state. Also, the Republican winning in Oklahoma with a big win for Kevin Stitt, following up on Mary Fallon, the incumbent Republican. And Rhode Island, the Democrat Gina Raimondo will win in Rhode Island's governor's race.
Let's bring in our next guest from the White House. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders joins us now. Sarah, good evening to you. Big election night. We're waiting for a lot of these results to come in, but how are folks at the White House feeling about this so far?
So far, we feel good about where we are. Frankly, right now, the president's had an incredible night, particularly when you look at Mike Braun. This was a candidate that a lot of people had projected to lose, and not just lose by a little bit, lose by a lot. This is somebody the president just went in and closed the deal for last night. This was also somebody who had an incredibly tough primary, and immediately following the primary, the president came in, unified the party, brought them together, and you're seeing the results of that hard work pay off tonight. So far, we feel good about where we are, but still a long night to go.
What do you think about the House? Like, what is the thinking at the White House, and what numbers you're looking at? Right now, Democrats need 23. They've picked up 2, and we haven't made a lot of calls along those lines.
Certainly the House is still early. One race to look at is Andy Barr of Kentucky. This was a race that a lot of people were saying was one to watch that could be one of the first indicators of what the night could look like. That's been called. This is another race where the president went in. Frankly, the candidates who have embraced the president and the president has gone in to campaign for over the last several weeks are candidates that we're doing very well tonight in those places, and certainly feel good about where things are headed. But again, very early in this process, but we feel very comfortable about where we are. Even James Carville, I think, said it best. Anybody that expected a blue wave tonight, probably not going to get that. And I think that is 100% due to the president's leadership and the success that he's had in the first 2 years since taking office. He's had unprecedented success, and you're seeing a lot of that pay off, and you're seeing Americans come out and unanimously say that they are proud of this president and proud of what he's done in these 2 years.
Sarah, thoughts on Florida? Obviously, the president put his weight behind Ron DeSantis, really helped him to win the primary there in a big way. Tight race there for the governor's race and also for the Senate right now.
Again, that's an extremely close race. This is a place where people said that there was no way Republicans could take either of those seats. And certainly if they do, I think that a lot of the credit will go to the president who's been in to campaign for them. But still very close and a little bit of time left to see what happens there.
Sarah, last thing. We had former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Randell on earlier, Democrat from Pennsylvania. He said if Democrats pick up the House, and that's still an if as of tonight, right now, that they should legislate, and not investigate. Do you think that would happen if Democrats take over the House?
I think that's what should happen. I think that's what America wants to see. Look, we have a president that's willing to work across the aisle to get things done. We feel good about where we are in the Senate, but if Democrats take the House, they shouldn't waste time investigating. They should focus on what the people have put them there to do. There are a lot of things that the president would love to work with them on, and hopefully they'll come to the table and be willing to do that and not continue to be the party of resist and obstruct, but want to actually work with this president to solve some of the big problems that we've been leading on over the last 2 years.
Sarah, there's been a lot of discussion about that the president didn't campaign hard enough on the issue of the economy. Even he said at one point at one of the rallies, sometimes the economy is not the most interesting thing to talk about. He really went in very intensely on the issue of the caravan and immigration. Is he feeling good about that decision right now?
Look, the president talked about the economy constantly. The problem was the media didn't want to cover the economy. It's the first time you'd ever have a booming economy, and they say you guys didn't talk about it enough. We talked about the economy every single day. We're going to continue to, because it's going to continue to do well under this president because of the tax cuts, because of deregulation. We've seen an economic boom like we haven't seen in decades, and I think you're seeing that reflected certainly in the Senate votes tonight, as well as the president's fight to get get Justice Kavanaugh on the bench. I think those are two big factors in the president's leadership that you're seeing play out on the election field
Sarah
tonight.
Sanders, live on the North Lawn of the White House. Sarah, thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Sarah.
We have a major race projection to make right now in that so-called jungle primary in Mississippi's special Senate election. Fox News Decision Desk can now project that none of the four candidates will win tonight because none will get 50% of the vote. So what does that mean? The top two finishers, you're looking at it right there, Republican incumbent Cindy Hyde-Smith and Democratic challenger Mike Espy, will face each other in a runoff election November 27th. It's early here, 10% in. You've got 43% to 39%. Bottom line is neither one will get to 50%. There is a scenario. It might not happen now with Joe Donnelly going down in Indiana, but the scenario would be for Democrats to take control, that they would win enough to have a 50-50 tie, and then with Mississippi hanging out there, it would be decided November 27th. Imagine that. One race, media, everyone, money.
After Thanksgiving.
After Thanksgiving. So it's possible, but we'll see. The balance of power now, Republicans are up one in the U.S. Senate.
We're going to take a quick break?
Yes.
Oh. All right. We're going to keep going. Do we have another race to call?
No. Let's bring in the panel.
Let's bring in the panel.
Carl, all right, talk to me about Texas.
Well, we got the early vote in, and we're missing Harris County, at least in the numbers I'm looking at. So early vote has been good for the Democrats in recent years, and there's a gap between the top of the ticket and the next person on it. Ted Cruz is losing and Greg Abbott is winning. My suspicion is that we're going to see a little bit more blue when Harris County comes in, but we have about 100 counties out in rural Texas, including places like Midland and Odessa and Abilene and Amarillo that are not in, and this is going to be a red state by the end of that process.
So right now, you say Cruz pulls this out, looking at the numbers you're looking at?
Yeah. But it's going to be a big gap. I mean, when you got the governor winning, the early vote is Democrat, and the Republican governor's winning by 10 points, and Ted Cruz is slightly behind.
We talked last night, Carl. You felt very good about this race. You said Texas will act like Texas in the end, and that he was way too progressive for Texas. So how do you explain how close this is?
Well, he's got a good absentee vote. If you take a look at it, for example, in the part of the state where I live, Travis County, it's always been the little blueberry in the middle of a big red sea. Well, there are two counties right next to it, Hayes and Williamson, that have been Republican, and in the early vote, they're Democrat. Now, part of that is that the Beto campaign, Robert Francis O'Rourke, did a good job of going to Texas State University.
You call him by the name that he likes to go by.
Well, I call him by the name that he appears on the ballot by. So, but they went to the Texas State University in San Marcos in Hayes County and insisted that they open up a special voting location, and literally 1,000 students a day were going through that special voting location last week, and I'm sure they broke 60, 40, 70, 30 for Robert Francis O'Rourke.
Okay. we got to run here, Britt. I'll come back to this. We are now ready to make one of the biggest calls of the night. The Fox News Decision Desk can now project that Democrats will take control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 8 years, dealing a major setback to President Trump's legislative agenda, giving fresh hope to liberals who want to investigate, as we just talked about, possibly even impeach the president. Democrats now will control the Senate.
Although the exact size of
the House, I'm sorry, the House.
Exact size of this, there's a look at the balance of power right now. The majority size is not clear yet. It could be a very slim margin. Democrats will soon have to decide whether they will restore Nancy Pelosi to her old job as Speaker of the House. I think there were 30-some candidates who ran on saying that they would not try to put Nancy Pelosi back in the Speaker's position. She's made it very clear that she thought that they would win and that she would indeed take that Speaker role again. Democrats control the House. The reason we can make that call is the voter analysis data plus the raw total, looking at the numbers, the decision desk making that call. Chris, your thoughts on that and what it means in the big picture?
It is a very, very big deal. I think of Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House, Adam Schiff as the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Elijah Cummings as the head of the House Oversight Committee, Jerry Nadler as the head of the Judiciary Committee, Maxine Waters, Financial Services. I know a lot of listeners out there, their heads are exploding, but this is going to be a very different Washington. And yes, I think that you'll see an effort to legislate, and maybe on things like infrastructure. There'll be a possibility of doing it. But one of the things that a lot of Democrats also believe that they have been sent to Washington to do in this new Congress will be to investigate. And you can be sure that they're going to haul members of the Trump administration up, and it'll make life very difficult for them. And there's been some criticism that the Trump White House is not prepared, as other White Houses have been when they lose control of one house, for the onslaught of investigations and subpoenas that they're about to face.
No, there were a lot of investigations by Republicans of the FBI and other subjects during these last couple of years. One difference we can certainly count on is that the investigations mounted by House Democrats into the Trump administration will receive far more favorable coverage than anything the Republicans have done in the last couple of years. It will likely be adoring coverage, and it will magnify the effect of it, because people are going to hear about it everywhere. And that's just a reality that the media we have today present.
Our bigger panel here, Steve, Molly, Katie, Carl. Molly, what are your thoughts on what this means?
Well, people should have had an expectation going into this, knowing that the average number of seats that Democrats were expected to get would be, just looking historically, was 28, which is more than was needed to take the House, that this was a natural result to expect. At the same time, I think it's actually challenging for Democrats, because a lot of the seats that they're picking up are these candidates who were moderate, who were appealing to voters precisely because they're moderate, to come in and make it an investigation agenda as opposed to an agenda to help the American people, might put those very same seats that they just won to get the majority in jeopardy. So it's going to be, I think, a debate in the Democratic side whether to appeal to the base and have, the investigation palooza, or to have a more broad legislative agenda.
Jessica, your reaction to the fact that Democrats have now taken majority of the House?
I'm so relieved and glad that I was on set for this moment, because I walked out here kind of panicked. I think it's great news. Obviously, when you saw the exit polls, it was very clear that health care was the #1 issue, and Democrats have been leading by 15 plus points on the issue of health care for months now. To your point, Molly, I think it's a little early to decide which way we're going to go, investigate or legislate. I hope it's legislate. There is room with President Trump, who has liberal roots and loves to build things, to do some infrastructure together and to get on the same page about a lot of issues that a more conservative Republican president might not have done. The balance of power in the Senate will also be huge here in deciding how much we can do in terms of working together. But big sigh of relief here, and interested in how big the margin ends up.
Yeah, Steve?
I think that when you look at the serious implications of this, it is pretty much bad news all round, because what it means is that you're going to get a dent in that economic progress, because people's confidence in the economy will suffer. I think business confidence will be undermined, and I think that could start to undermine the boom that we've seen. But I think
let me just interrupt you. Historically, the markets have liked the split government.
Gridlock.
The Clinton,
markets like gridlock.
The Clinton government, they kind of liked that government. But I know what you're saying as far as moving things forward with the Trump agenda.
I think what they'll be worried about is an expectation that you're going to see a return, if this is a sign of things to come, a return to the days of regulation and high taxes that get in the way of enterprise. And I think that will be the thing to look out for. But in terms of the politics, I think that, as Molly was saying, if we think about where we are right now, it feels to me as if actually the Democrats are underperforming the expectation. And in fact, if you look at what's going on as of now, could change, of course, it feels like the Trump effect, if you like, is positive, not negative. Where he really put the effort in, that's delivering the results for the Republicans. And on the other hand, what the Democrats and the resistance movement particularly were hoping for, this massive repudiation of Donald Trump and everything he stood for, that doesn't seem to be transpiring. And what we're getting is a pretty much of a tepid result. Of course, it gives them control, as we're projecting, and that will have real-world consequences. But politically, this doesn't feel like the kind of result that they were looking for at all.
Yeah.
Just to pick on what we were saying earlier, it's worth remembering that even if he were to lose control of the Senate, his tax cut is protected because he can protect it with a veto. He can also protect all the things that went with it. So an awful lot of his program is in place
and key regulation.
He can continue to do what he's been doing. So the legislative effect of this, I think, will be gridlock. And as you pointed out, markets have liked gridlock in the past. It won't be. There'll be no big regulatory legislative agenda, but the main pieces of his economic program are in place and almost certain to stay.
And Katie, quickly, he'll also now have a foil as he gets ready for 2020.
Right. He has someone to run against, and that will be House Democrats, especially if they go with the investigative route. When you have people like Maxine Waters, Elijah Cummings, and Adam Schiff in line for these chairmanships on the Oversight Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, et cetera, I think that the Republicans in the White House are in for some pretty serious rides. But moving forward on the Senate, so far, we have to look at the Marsha Blackburn race. She is far more on the Trump agenda than Bob Corker was. That's a win for President Trump and his agenda. And although the House is flipped, which causes legal problems for the White House, the Senate can do a lot on the president's agenda, especially when it comes to judges, even if the House has been flipped, or the House has been flipped.
You know, an interesting thing is going to be what's the margin going to be for the Democrats and who is making up those new members. There are 58 challengers, Democratic challengers, who are on the record saying they will not support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. And there are 11 incumbent Democrats, all of whom are returning, who've said, I will not support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. So if she does, if the number is 225 or 230, and we've got 11 Democrats already for certain returning, be joined by a group of new people saying not Nancy Pelosi, could be a problem getting 218 votes to make her Speaker of the House.
Panel, thank you. The other question is how many cabinet members decide to exodus before the investigations start. We will see. We have a lot of tight races. We're getting close to some calls, we think. We're going to bring that to you all after the break.
Take a look at Missouri right after the break. We are back. Let's take a look at some of these key Senate races of the Big Ten that we've been watching all along. We are waiting for results from Arizona, which is still too close to call at this point. Take a look at Texas as well, which is a very interesting race, 49.7 to 49.2. That's 7% in at this point, but that one may be a lot closer than it looked like it was going to be going in. Let's take a look at Florida as well. In the top left-hand corner there, you see Bill Nelson, longtime incumbent senator against Rick Scott, the former governor in Florida. That one is also a very tight race. Scott is slightly ahead at this point, 95% of that in. Still waiting for the Panhandle, still waiting for Palm Beach County, Broward County in the Florida races, which have become very interesting tonight. Missouri as well, just to round up there, 46.4% for Josh Hawley and 51.2% for Claire McCaskill. There's a lot still to come in the Missouri race.
And that's where Steve Ducey is right now, talking to voters. I think he's still in that pub. Are you still there?
How you doing there, Steve?
Springfield?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, you know, when you came to me 3 hours ago here at the Patton Alley Pub in Springfield, Missouri, there were only about 10 people here. But because we were on television, everybody from the county came because Fox News is making this election central for Springfield, Missouri. All right. Now I'm going to poll the audience right now regarding the Senate. Who wants to hear some news about the Senate? It is still too close to call. Sorry. All right. However, let me ask this. How many here tonight voted earlier today for Claire McCaskill? Make some noise. Okay, very good. And how many people voted for Josh Hawley? Number one issue for you voting. Who thought it was health care? Really? Nobody? Economy. One of Josh Hawley's number one issues was Judge Kavanaugh. All right. And what about the caravan? Anything there? Not so much on this. This guy right here, Alan, we were talking to him earlier. What was your number one issue this year?
Well, for us, it's the economy. We, Lucas and I, my son, we're partners in a small business. We're auctioneers and realtors. And the economy is going very well right now. I don't want to do anything to mess that up, and I felt like I had to vote Republican all the way.
But your son did not vote Republican.
No, typically I do vote Republican, but this time around I wasn't a big fan of either of the candidates. I voted third party. I felt like Claire had been there a little long, and I felt like that Josh was taking another step in the political ladder. So I voted third party this time.
All right. One other question as we walk over here. How many people thought that this election was a referendum about the president of the United States. Well, not so much. And listen, before we go, got to introduce this table of young people right here because they came in right after our live shot earlier. And Brett and Martha, the reason they came, they're all dressed up, is because they're going to the Josh Hawley victory party. Fingers crossed, they said earlier. But the reason they came back here was because there is a rumor on the internet that apparently Bret Baier is going to buy the entire bar drinks. So we're just going to have to find out about that.
I heard that too.
It's on. I'll give him my credit card.
Yeah, right?
All right, Steve, thank you very much. Have a great night. We want to go back just a second to Indiana, and this is a huge win for the Republicans against the incumbent Joe Donnelly, who just released a statement saying, a few minutes ago, I called Mike Braun, congratulated him on winning a hard-fought race. I'd like to thank every single American who believed in this campaign and worked to make it successful, and every Hoosier whom I have come across over the last 6 years who helped me to better serve my state. It's been one of the greatest honors of my life to represent Indiana in the Senate. I wish Mike the best. I hope he makes every single Hoosier proud as our senator. The incumbent Senator Joe Donnelly losing to Republican Mike Braun.
Yep. And we're watching Florida very closely. It looks like a lot of the vote is in Florida. Rick Scott is a little bit ahead right now. If he does end up winning, that would be another pickup. Too close to call at this point, as I said. The difference is 83,000 votes, according to the numbers that we have up there. But that's one that we're watching really closely as well.
Let's bring in our panel back. Carl, you're just writing stuff out there. What do you got?
Well, just looking at the gap in Texas between Greg Abbott and Ted Cruz, and back and forth, but just the maneuvering.
Okay, no whiteboard tonight.
I got a whiteboard, but their security took it away from me. They said that you considered it a threat, so I don't know. Maybe we can bring it on later with your personal permission.
Of course, of course. Britt, as you look at the night, this is going to come down to the drama of the Senate. And really, if that firewall, now that the House, we've called for the Democrats, whether the president has a firm control of his party in the Senate.
Yeah, and